So like the mom who lets her child go off to college, and the child got to drive to college.
Yeah.
And the child dies on the way to college in a car. And now the mom feels guilty because, oh, I shouldn't have let my daughter take the car.
Yeah.
Now my daughter's dead. Well, she's not guilty. She might feel guilty, but she's not actually guilty. She'd actually be guilty if she attached a bomb to the car and it blew up while her daughter was driving. That would be actual guilt.
Okay.
Okay. So now we're talking about like the different types of guilt, but then we're talking about how to distinguish between actual guilt and, pseudo guilt. But then once you get to actual guilt, you even want to make another distinction between like guilt feelings and a guilt violation, because it's possible that you are guilty. You blew the car up, but you don't feel guilty. But it's also possible to feel guilty for something. Like my child got in a car accident, but you're not guilty.
Yeah.
Because there wasn't a bomb there.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot that goes on, and all this plays an incredible role on our psyche and how we go about putting our life back together.
Yeah, definitely. Wow, you opened up so many different, So I think one of the other important distinctions that we need to talk about, just particularly with what you were mentioning there at the end, is the difference between guilt and shame, because often those two are confused. Sometimes we might feel shame when we did something wrong when we shouldn't. And sometimes we're guilty and we don't feel shame. So what's the difference between guilt and shame, and what do we do with some of those shame feelings?
Well, I think part of becoming emotionally mature is learning to distinguish our emotional life. Our emotional life is a sea of just emotions that are turbulent at times, placid at other times. But we have to learn to recognize and distinguish the nature of our emotional life. Shame versus guilt. Guilt is I have done wrong. Shame is I am bad, right? Guilt is I've done something bad. Shame says I'm bad because I've done that.
Oh, okay.
Shame really tackles our identity. And that's why it's so much worse, like from the standpoint of when we're working with people, hey, we can recognize that somebody has done wrong and we can offer forgiveness. But if somebody's done wrong and you shame them, you really can do a number on a person's psyche because you're getting at their identity. And I think that what's beautiful about the cross, for example, is God's not shaming us. He says we're guilty, but he provides a way to deal with our guilt. And also he recognizes how powerful shame is in our life and wants to help us out of shame. So you have some cultures that are primarily shame cultures,
right,
and other cultures that are more guilt cultures. So you think about like the Olympics, when you see the Chinese go to the Olympics. I mean, this is a shame culture.
Yeah.
You are bad if you don't win.
Yeah.
Right? That's a big difference compared to a guilt culture, which would say, you've done something wrong, but you're not necessarily bad because you've done something wrong.
Right. And I think that's a really helpful distinction. And one of the things that I do think that we need to draw out as Christians, because somewhere along the line, maybe you know the answer to this, it seems like those two things have gotten conflated, particularly in the church. So I don't know if it's the common mantra of like hate the sin, love the sinner that, this has been going on. But I think it's something that I would love to get your insight on here, because there are some things where we have done wrong. We are sinners, Romans 3. But some of us feel that we have guilt because of our sin, right? But then other people feel shame. And so what role has the church play, or what role can the church play in distinguishing those two things and saying, yes, you have messed up, right? Yes, you have sinned, whatever the situation is, but you don't feel shame. And why do you feel like those two things often get conflated in the church?
I think probably the bigger thing is because people don't properly distinguish between shame and guilt, you'll get some people, because they don't want people to feel shamed.
Yeah.
And as a result, they seek to eliminate the guilt. So you take the LGBTQ, for example. We in the church shouldn't want to shame the LGBT community.
Right.
But the solution shouldn't be to say that you're not guilty if you're acting outside of God's biblical plan of sexuality.
Yeah.
So I think in our attempt to not shame people, what we end up doing, because we don't have a proper, clear definition to distinguish between guilt and shame, is, well, we end up basically saying, oh, and you're not even guilty.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that becomes a real problem. Now, you get some people who are happy to tell you that you're guilty and you ought to be ashamed of yourself.
Right.
Right? Now, I do think that there's an element, like, for example, there is a proper place for shame.
Okay.
But I think it needs to leave quickly.
Yeah.
Like, if I had an affair on my wife, I'm guilty. But there is an element where I should be ashamed of myself for that. Like, that was a horrible thing.
Yeah.
But you can't live in that shame because it'll just tear you up to the core. And so you've got to move toward a solution.
Yeah.